Welcome to How the Frisco Railroad Built the Town of Springfield, Missouri. This presentation is brought to you by Richard Crabtree, Realtor from Ernie Associates, specializing in the sale of older homes here in the greater Springfield area. If you're looking to find a realtor who knows the history, how to restore and list and sell older homes, I would be more than happy to help. On with our program. Well, Springfield, Missouri in the 1850s was a small town, pretty much huddled around the center of the square. And the thought of having a railroad here was something they had dreamed of. The good news was prior to the Civil War and during, the thought was the best way to unify this country was to hook it up through a transcontinental railroad. Prior to the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln had worked as a railroad attorney and took a keen interest in railroad activity. And he had worked with other people in the House and the Senate. And Jefferson Davis, of all people, was tapped to come up with three distinct routes that they could take. The southern route, which would benefit the Southern cause or slavery cause, was obviously not going to be in the picture during the war. The middle route, which would be more so our route, leading from St. Louis, coming through Springfield, and either heading out through Fort Smith or Springfield, heading west to Sacramento and on to San Francisco. Then there was the northern route, which obviously we are familiar with, as it just celebrated its 150th anniversary this year, the transcontinental route linking the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific railroads. The people who were involved with this concept of a transcontinental railroad via St. Louis would be General Fremont. Now, Mr. Fremont was very popular during the Civil War, and Fremont Road here in Springfield is named after him. Of course, we'd had Colonel Phelps and Colonel Boyd, who were involved with the railroad as well when they were in the House and Senate. And they were the ones who helped procure the land that would be utilized for the railroad. After the Civil War, the rail line had stopped in Rolla during the war and had not proceeded any further. The railroad was then handed off to General Fremont. This was his map of the route heading out to Sacramento. This is kind of a combination of the northern and southern middle route. He was a great general, but he was a horrible, horrible businessman. He only completed 13 miles in less than a year, and the Union Pacific was doing that almost in a day. So needless to say, he lost the line. So if you were trying to traverse from Rolla to Springfield, you were still coming by stagecoach, which was a long, arduous journey filled with not only dust and bumps, but possible bandits. This was the line, or the vision of the line, coming out of St. Louis, and it does show going into Indian Territory. You also notice that it says Atlantic and Pacific, as that was one of the original names, and you can actually even see the connection coming from Fort Smith. So if we zoom further in, we can see where the rail line had stopped, and by 1869 they had reached Lebanon, and were focusing to hit Springfield by 1870. So when the railroad came to town, it was going to be an interesting placement for the railroad, as the town folk all suspected that it would be close to downtown. The railroads, if you understand their history, they tended to like to build close to a town and establish a new town. Therefore, they got most of the profits and buildings and development of the town under their name. And this was not uncommon with all the railroads. Mr. Pierce, Andrew Pierce Jr., had acquired the line, or this section of it anyway. He lived out in Boston, and he was here trying to procure where it would go next. The thing that he told the folks in Springfield, that they could have their downtown run if they were willing to give him $25,000. Mr. Boyd and Mr. had worked on the railroad before with General Fremont, So he kind of knew where they were going and what they were trying to do. So he reached out to Mr. Harwood and Mr. Roberson. Mr. Roberson owned a lot of land in North Springfield, and they formed a partnership. They then approached Mr. Pierce and decided that they would offer to him 40 acres of land north of Commercial Street. Of course, Commercial Street didn't exist yet, but that's where it was located, where they would build their future shops. He would also give them a right-of-way for a station and a freight station, and they would also give them a half interest in the town. And needless to say, Mr. Pierce jumped on that opportunity, much to the chagrin of the folks of Springfield. Hence, we have the formation of North Springfield. This is when the town would officially split from Springfield and have its own government and its own layout. And actually, the first two parks that we currently have in our current Springfield were formed in North Springfield, Lafayette and Washington. We can see the passenger depot where it would be, and then, of course, the 40 acres given to the railroad company. Incidentally, that spot is still there. It is a railroad tie company. The first train that came to town was on May 3rd, 1870, and it was quite the celebration. All the dignitaries, all the people that I had mentioned previously were there. They rode down from St. Louis. We had about 400 to 500 people that gathered at the depot, and lots of political speeches, lots of hurrah, patting themselves on the back. And the very next day, they started passenger service. The Atlantic and Pacific, or the Frisco, that would eventually become, these were the north shops that were built north of Commercial Street. And in 1873, they had employed 400 men making $2.50 a day. They had established the roundhouse, machine shops, paint shops, oil house, brass foundry, ice house, coal chutes were all in place within the next 3 years by 1876. Here we see Frisco number 143, a 460 10-wheeler built by Baldwin Locomotive Works in 1898 in the Frisco North Shops Roundhouse, which is interesting because this is the only shot that we know of that shows the roundhouse in its original configuration. By 1902, 1910, the yards had greatly expanded, as they now had a mill shop, boiler tank shop, locomotive erecting shops, caboose shops, storehouse, and more. And you can see on the far left there that the roundhouse is more than doubled in size. Here's a wonderful picture that was taken by a commercial street photographer by the name of Harry Morgan. This was taken prior to the turn of the century, and we are looking east to southeast. One of the things that was an advantage of being up on Commercial Street and being next to the railroad, the photographers had several shops up there, and they would frequently visit the railroad, as the photographers tended to make the most money of most of the blue-collar workers in the Springfield area. Therefore, they tended to have a little extra cash to take home a snapshot of themselves at work. And here we are at the coach shops, and taken in October 31st of 1907. This is a very happy bunch. They, for the most part, have smiles on their face. Looks like they enjoy what they're doing. Then we get to the blacksmiths, taken in 1905, and they're a dour bunch with their sledgehammers and their stern looks. But if you kind of look over in the far left and about the middle, there's a guy there with a big old grin. Obviously, he didn't get the note that we're supposed to look tough today. And, of course, you can't have all the blue-collar folks without the white-collar folks. So here we have the North Side supervisors, and they are in the erecting repair shops. And they were, most of the time, folks that had came up through the ranks. So they did sympathize with what their colleagues were going through. The Frisco line had beautification contests up and down the lines, and they would appear in their Frisco Man magazine. And this is on Commercial Street. So we would actually be on Commercial Street looking to the northwest towards the Frisco shops. And the shops store was mainly for the employees, but other folks could drop in and buy things. So if you're going to have a station, you needed to have a place where maybe the executives could work or visit when they came through town, as they were mainly based in St. Louis. So we have the Frisco, the Ozark Hotel, the Frisco Station, and of course the Opera House, all built about that same time frame. First, let's look at the old and new Ozark Hotel. We have one that was built in 1870 and another in 1878. The original one was constructed of lumber for $30,000, and it was owned by Mr. Dunlap and Mr. Harwood. Now, Mr. Harwood, of course, was part owner of the new North Springfield. Fire broke out April 7th of 1875. It was a $65,000 loss, and they were only insured for $24,000. But they realized that they needed to have a new Ozark house, so they built one in 1878, and that was about the time that the Frisco offices were then procured there at the upper floor, and especially to have the kind of turret lookout so they could look over the yards. It became one of the busiest spots in all of Springfield as people were coming and going, staying there. Business people would have shops and offices there, as well as people just coming through. They were there up until 1910 for almost 33 years. The Frisco North Station survived, we believe, from 1870 till about 1910. Could have been about 1905. We really don't know. The station evolved over the years. This is a Sanborn map showing it in 1897. And then by 1902, we can see that there's a subway in place. Now, it's funny, what we call a viaduct, back then they would call a subway. But whatever you want to call it, it was where the road went under the tracks. This particular picture is from the History Museum on the Square. This is a great picture because it is a rare picture. This is a nice, clean photograph of the station, and some of these lines that you see on the north and south of the station have been removed recently to expand for parking on Commercial Street. On the far left, you can see the roundhouse and the smokestack coming from it and the coaling towers. On the far right, you can just make out the Ozark Hotel. And here's a rare picture that Harry Morgan had taken of this particular locomotive. It was famous because it had amassed over 1 million miles on the Frisco line and had been rebuilt several times. It was finally retired, though, in the around World War II. The Frisco Opera House is really the only building that is still left standing up there that was tied to the Frisco at that particular time. It is now Eurasia Coffee and Tea House, and it's a hotel. The Opera House was built in 1882, and it's at the northwest corner of Benton and Commercial, and it would have been across from the Ozark Hotel and the station. The seating capacity was 500 to 700 people. Basically, the Frisco utilized this as a union engineer/fireman's hall, where they would have union meetings, dances, parties, and they would have people come in to do lectures, such as Dr. O'Leary giving his celebrated private lecture for men only on the origins of life. That would be worth seeing. And of course, when the boys came home from World War I, they would come out and they could see this nice welcoming for them out on Commercial Street. And we've already seen by this time in 1919 that Commercial Street had a fair amount of brick buildings on it already. The big problem, which has never seemed to have went away, is how in the world do we get from the north and the south, and especially when the subways or underpasses tend to flood? Aha! Well, we end up with the Jefferson Avenue footbridge. The footbridge was built in 1902. The problem was the Frisco had 13 tracks going across from Commercial to Chase Street, and people tended to frequently run across the railroad tracks and get hit, injure themselves, cause problems, and that was a nuisance to the railroad as they would sue them for compensation. So they had threatened to move the hub from this section down to Monette. So the Commercial Street merchants, not the city, bonded together and raised the money that was needed to build the bridge. It was built by the American Bridge Works out of New York after basically combining almost 20 different bridge companies. John Pierpont Morgan was the leader of this particular group, and this was their first large order. It was a cantilever bridge that looks like a suspension bridge, 532 feet long, expanding to 13 tracks. Well, not everybody was enthused with the amount of time it was taking to get this done, and when you have 20 companies combined under one, synergy and communication was not exactly their forte. So some people really just got frustrated, and Allie Moore was a lady who needed to go shopping, and she decided enough was enough, and on August 29th, 1902, she proceeded to walk across the bridge, even though there were no railings on the bridge and only half the decking was in place. But she was known as the first person. By the next day, all the decking was down, but it took 2 more weeks to get the side rails. And here's a great rare photograph that we have, also looking at the station and roundhouse, and you can see there in the side a portion of the footbridge. The Frisco Hospital was something that was a necessity. There was a large one in St. Louis, and Springfield definitely needed one, as we were the furthest southwest of the line or main hub at the time. So in 1899, they decided that they would deduct anywhere from 35 to 50 cents from each employee's paychecks. And it was built by the actual employees. They figured, well, we build stations and bridges and so forth. Why can't we build a hospital? It cost them $40,000, or a little over $1 million adjusted for inflation. It was located at Broadway, Missouri in Atlantic, and was operated by the Sisters of Mercy out of Fort Scott, Kansas. It closed, unfortunately, in 1922, and it was demolished in 1924. However, the parts of this building have been reused in Springfield, specifically in houses. The Kansas City, Fort Scott, and Gulf or Mobile Railroad actually offered some competition to the Frisco and much needed relief for the original inhabitants of the town of Springfield. So they decided to lay a line coming to Springfield in 1879, so about 9 years after the Frisco had made it into town. And by 1882, they started to build a yard and station. Now, they were actually offered up to $50,000 if they would locate their yard up in the north part near the other stations, but they opted not to. So in 1883, they continued finishing up their shops and their yards. This would be near where Mill and Main is today. And but a sense of irony in this whole affair. It was somewhat ironic that in 1901 the Frisco would take over operations of the Kansas City, Fort Scott, and Gulf/Mobile railroads, and creating the X in the system. And you can clearly see this here as you have Kansas City down to Birmingham/Pensacola, and from St. Louis out past Oklahoma City into Texas. In 1886, the Kansas City and Fort Scott and Memphis Railroad shops were still under construction. They were actually going to have a fairly good-sized roundhouse down there, but they erected their shops slightly differently. As you can see here in 1905, they had a little bit more ornate brickwork. It actually was located by Springfield Brewing Company, which would be to the far left of this picture. By 1910, you can see the shops had grown quite a bit. They've done quite a bit of expansion, as the Frisco, during their merger, ended up transferring their main passenger hub down here. As you can see in this photograph, that the yards are quite busy. If you look in the very far left, you can see a smokestack with some black smoke coming out. and that would be the Springfield Brewing Company on College Street. Here we are looking at the South Side shops, looking up towards the Frisco passenger station at Millen, Maine, and then the freight depot. You can see they're quite extensive. If you look over to the right, you can actually see the Missouri Pacific Railroad with its connection down to Crane, Missouri. And here's a view here in the 1950s. And you can actually see that there's a lot of the tracks and a lot of the activity around those particular shops and yards have ceased to exist. Well, the Kansas City Fort Scott and Gulf / Mobile Station was a very ornate brick station that they had built at Millen, Maine. We can see it here as it was completed in 1882. And it would end up really replacing the station up on Commercial Street, which sometime between 1905 and 1909 they had shifted all passenger service to the south. Here is the layout of the station as of 1916. Just right behind the station, there on Maine, you can see the Frisco Freight Depot, which was this was built right around 1909. Well, next to the station, we can see the original lunchroom or Harvey House. And it was quite a small structure, but it did what it could to take care of the needs of the hungry passengers coming on and off the train. In the front of the station, the Harvey House actually ran basically a postal / magazine, cigar, candy place where you can grab some quick things and jump back on the train. And at the far end, you can see the Wells Fargo Express Company. By 1919, as the doughboys were coming back from Europe, even though they were having them come off here, they had to divert some of this traffic up to North Springfield, and we saw earlier in the slides. And so at that time, they really decided we need a larger station. So that's what they started to work on. So this would be the new station to replace the existing station that was there. Plans began in 1923. They decided on a Spanish Mission look, and this was something that they hoped to complete quickly. But there was a problem. They did not want to go through the same problem that they did with the footbridge up in North Springfield, so they opted to approach the city and create the Grant Avenue overpass or bridge, and they wanted the city to kick in and pay for half of it. It took them about 3 years to finally get it on the ballot, and everybody voted yes that we should do this, and now we could have uninterrupted train service without the fear of cars or passengers getting in the way. The gentleman they reached out to was very well known in Springfield, W.W. Johnson. Will Johnson projected that it would cost about $250,000, a little over $3 million adjusted for inflation, to rebuild this station and face it with the stucco and the Spanish Mission look. He had recently completed some other very famous buildings here in Springfield that some are still standing. The Killingsworth Service and the Pickwick Stage are still standing today. The Schulten House, unfortunately, was demolished. That was down on Republic Road near Glenstone. We have a food market there today. And Thompson Tires, which has unfortunately been torn down. Inland Printing, though, is still there today, as it is Sherwin-Williams. So they began quick work on the station. This is one of the few things that are still left. You can go down there and still see the concrete platforms as they went down, and then they had the covered overhead for you to debark the train and get to the station. The station was completed December the 24th of 1926, just in time for Christmas. Merry Christmas to them. However, the waiting room, when they got done, was quite large. It was almost triple the size of what they currently had before, could hold 305 people. The new Harvey House, though, it actually opened about a month earlier. It was opened on November the 4th of 1926. And Harvey House, of course, became a big tradition for many Springfield families, as it was a place to go after church or on special occasions, and just to go down there and watch the trains come and go. They had an extensive kitchen. This is something that you can still see, in the sense that if you go down the Mill and Main, you can see the brick and you can see the tile of the Harvey House kitchen and the restaurant. The trains that started to come in down there became much larger, as the Frisco also started to build trains here in Springfield. And here's a mountain class that was actually built in the West Shops in 1940. And we can see here another couple of locomotives that were redone, built and or rebuilt at the Frisco West Shops, which we'll be talking about in a few more slides. Well, John T. Woodruff, if it was not for him, the Frisco would not be nearly as large or have such a presence that it did here in Springfield. He moved to Springfield from the St. Louis area in 1904 to become the attorney for the Frisco in the state of Missouri. He convinces the Frisco management that since they now have the completed X of the two lines merged together, that Springfield would be the perfect place for a large new shop. He then signs as of 1909 to focus building on Springfield, and we'll go over what he did and why he did when he did. Construction begins in 1907. Now, what's very interesting about this is you would think that there would be tons and tons of people at this time willing to come work and build. They had one heck of a time trying to get enough skilled employees to come to Springfield to actually build these shops. So something that should have taken about a year took over 2. And they were to be extensive, quite large. Now, this was an artist rendition. Artist renditions tend to be a little bit more elaborate, as there's 2 massive roundhouses that never got built. And pretty much this was built kind of about half the size that it ended up being. You can see here they actually have their own power plant, and they actually had a coal ramp where they could take the coal cars up there and dump to feed the power plant. Between the buildings, they actually had as opposed to a roundhouse, they had a track that would just go horizontal up and down, where you can move the trains back and forth, or the passenger cars or freight cars in between the buildings. And what was really interesting is that the Frisco, as well as working with Springfield Traction Company, had specials where you could go out there on the weekend, Saturday and Sunday. You take the train out there and just walk around and see what they were building. The building itself was built by the Arnold Company out of Chicago on 240 acres. And of course, like I said, there was a delay due to manpower. They opened on July 4th of 1909. The shops cost about $2 million or $50 million adjusted for inflation today. And unlike the original drawings, you can see it is much smaller. And you also notice a lake, which we'll be talking about shortly. This lake was later called Lake Frisco, and the water was utilized mainly for the power plant to get it enough water so they didn't have to rely on the Springfield water system, and that way they could generate their own energy, and much to the chagrin of Springfield Gas and Electric. But nonetheless, it was the largest shops built west of the Mississippi at the time. And here we are on July 4th of 1909 with the happy crew that came out to visit and walk around and see the brand new shops. And you can see it decked out in the American flags for celebrating 4th of July. And they had a lovely fireworks display there that day as well. Well, what was interesting, the Frisco, as building the town as far as building up shops and implying jobs and things of that nature, a lot of people started to buy up land around the West Shops and start subdivisions. Now, today, we would think of living next to a big working facility as a horrible idea. But you have to remember, back in that time frame, a majority of folks did not own cars, and they either had to walk or they could take the streetcar. And there was a streetcar line ran to the shops, and if you were close enough, they could walk. The other advantage was that if a whistle blew during the changing of shifts, the women knew when their husbands were coming home or needed to be at work. And so it was a win-win at the time, but it was a different era. One of the coolest things that they were able to do is on June 28, 1910, in 8.5 hours, they completely rebuilt this locomotive at that facility, which is an incredible task. It would be hard to max today. Then, of course, just like at the other shops, the Frisco employees love to get their picture taken by the locomotives. And this is a sister to 1522, number 1515. And it was September the 9th of 1926 that 900, or a few of the 900 employees of the West Shop showed up to get their pictures taken. And the one nice thing that they would do back in the day, and this was in June of 1935, they would invite the employees' families to come out and open house and walk around and just see where Dad worked, or Grandpa worked, or their uncle. And I've used to do this growing up in Granite City Steel with my grandfather, and it was a lot of fun. So I'm sure the people really enjoyed being able to walk up close and see all this stuff. And they could relate better to when they came home and shared stories. They're like, oh yeah, I saw that. Here's another great locomotive that the guys wanted to pile around, but there was a reason that they wanted to get around this locomotive, because it was actually built at the West Shops in 1936. Can you imagine that? Here in Springfield, Missouri, we actually used to build locomotives. And here is one that was rebuilt, but rebuilt in such a way where they added on the fancy skirting and dialed up the tender a little bit to give it more of a streamlined look. We have to remember cars were starting to get more popular and air travel was starting to increase, and passenger service was starting to thin out a little bit. Hence the whole reason that the Firefly was built with all the aluminum and steel sheeting around it. It's a beautiful engine. I wish we had this in color, as it was blue and white with some gold. And it was fabricated in the Frisco West Shops in 1940. And it mainly traversed from Kansas City to Tulsa. Well, as I mentioned before, John Woodruff, he had left the Frisco and was working on some other projects, mainly building around Springfield, and he decided that he would construct the Frisco's new offices. Now, this was very convenient for him because this was next door to the church that he went to. It was built on the original grounds of the Springfield High School at the northwest corner of Jefferson and Olive. They started in 1910, and it was dedicated the following year in 1911 in February. And then the shops proceeded to move from the old OZARK Hotel up on Commercial Street to here. And for about the first 10 years thereabout, he rented it, and then he finally sold the building to them. The Frisco used this building up until 1964. Here we see some of the employees gathered out in 1926 after about the time frame that they had taken ownership of the building. And here we see John T. Woodruff next to the church, next to the Frisco office building where he had built and where he went to church. The Frisco during World War II became very, very important because of the X in being in the middle of the country and access to water, specifically down in Florida. It gave it the ability to ship a lot of oil from Texas and Oklahoma at different parts of the country. And the Frisco at its peak moved 9.4 billion tons of freight miles and 1,103 billion passenger miles just in 1944. So you take in consideration what they moved from late 41 through 45, it was quite staggering. And here we have a very rare video footage of the Frisco North Shops taken by Millard Morrow sometime in the 1940s. Enjoy. We are standing on the Jefferson Avenue footbridge, and we are starting to pan to the west. Here you can see the mills. Now we're panning over to the northeast and east. We can see the coaling towers. We can see the roundhouse. in a very active yard. And we are panning now towards commercial. And we are now looking at the Washington Avenue Viaduct. Well, after World War II, the Frisco went under a massive change in something that was quite unique. Clark Hungerford had came here to the Frisco in 1947. He had been the vice president of the Southern Railways. He decided that the Frisco would be the first railroad in the country, first class 1A railroad, to be completely dieselized, and he did accomplish that by 1953. Diesels had been around for a while. The problem were they weren't as strong and they weren't as efficient as steam locomotives. And especially where he came from in that part of the country, there was tons and tons of coal. So a lot of those railroads would not bring diesels on for a very late time. But he decided that we could cut down on the man hours, cut down on maintenance if we could run everything by diesel. So he started bringing in diesels, and here are the Frisco EMD E7As from 1947 that would become the Frisco Meteor and the first Texas Special. And here we see another one, and these were kind of a black and gold configuration that came the EMD's F3As from 1948. Funny that they're replaced by the coaling tower. In the background, you can actually see the footbridge on Commercial Street, and of course she is flying white flags, meaning it's special. Here's the real beautiful pair, or trio, I should say, the Frisco MD's E8As from 1950. And of course, all of these were named after racehorses. And here's what they did to kind of create some uniformity for the Frisco. They decided to take their early 47 models and doll them up to make them look like the 1950 models. By bringing them into the shops, repainting them, and adding some grill work, they came out to look just as beautiful as the ones they had ordered from the factory. And we started to see more and more diesels show up on the line, but there were still some Frisco steam still being utilized, although some of that had been shifted more to switching or shorter runs. Here we have Millard Morrow's actually with the Alco GEFA1, number 5203, built in 1948. And it too is flying white flags, as it must be a special. In the background here, we can actually see the smokestack for the power plant. And the water tower. And we are getting ready to head out on the road. It's a shame none of these have survived. They would be great to restore. There's a few of them that are laying around out there that different railroads are trying to restore. Something we dearly miss seeing, a good old Frisco caboose. And off we go to St. Louis. Well, by the 1951, they had already started seeing the end of steam, as we started to see more and more diesels taking their spot. And then, of course, the big change, too, was we started seeing more and more freight service pop in. This was something that would be expanded upon, and most railroads should have had, but the Frisco Transportation Company had their setup down here by the freight depot. Here we can see one of the trucks that they had under the Grant Viaduct. The unfortunate thing is during the merger, this particular line would eventually be phased out as the new owners didn't see the benefit that Frisco did. Well, we get now to the diesel shops, and these were quite something else. The diesel shops, when they were to be built, were going to be just huge, and it was the first shop really designed solely for a diesel layout. Now, what do we see here? Well, we can see the town's grown quite a bit in the last 50, 60 years as there's more and more buildings built and more homes. The stockyards are here. We have the classification yard over here, the main line out to Monette, and then we have the High Line here on our right heading out through Benwood, and you can see the original layout of the shops. So the diesel shops would be the first all diesel shops west of the Mississippi. They started in 1948 and they were finished by 1950. And then they started putting in the tracks that they needed to have. Here's a great overview. You can see the tracks and everything being laid in, and lots of cars being brought in with ballast to fill in spots. They had to bring in millions of loads of dirt to fill in the lake to expand the yard. The old Frisco Lake had been done away with, and they wanted a much more larger classification yard. So the topsoil was brought in for that. We see the big diesel tanks here on our right, and of course the moats that they had created in case there was an emergency that they could spill into there. And here we have a view looking more northeast. We can see the new offices that they have built, as well as the shops. The one thing we don't see we see today, there is no Kansas bridge going over the rail yard. That would be coming later. But you do see the sanding towers that would be where the hoisters would work to take care of the trains as they were coming in. Here's the Frisco shops for the main offices that they used here for the yards that were brand new and completed. And here, again, we're thankful that MORROW decided to go out one day and take some video of these buildings. We are looking over at the diesel shops. Wouldn't you love to have one of those beautiful old cars? Here comes another Frisco caboose into the yard. And now we're panning over to where Kansas would eventually cross over. And one of the beautiful passenger locomotives. And of course we have freight. And switching. It was a busy yard. Well, the diesel shops were a great success, and they continued to expand them and add on more bays, and creating more lines and more service through here. And a lot of the engines would be transferred up here to be worked on. Here we are inside the actual shops, and we can see the heavy equipment that was utilized to repair these engines. As we can see them, one of the overhead cranes pulling one of the engines out to be rebuilt. It's beautiful to see all this nice Frisco locomotives hanging around, considering what's there today. The Frisco Laboratory and Testing Research Building was right next door. Anything that the Frisco utilized, whether it was gas, water, oil, machinery, all had to be shipped here and tested before it was used on the line. So it was a pretty important place. Well, the headquarters, as I mentioned, 1964 would not be in the old building, would be moved to the new building. And unfortunately today, this particular building no longer says Frisco, although the coonskin and number are still there, but the name has been removed. Well, you know, the 1950s and early 60s were still a good time for the Frisco, as you could still see passenger and freight service. And we are downtown again, back at Millen, Maine, as the trains are continuously rolling into the station and hauling people around. The problem was that the cars and airplanes were continuing to take their toll on train service around the country. And we can see that here, as we can see that in 1920, 15 million passengers carried per year was the peak, and it did spike back up again during World War II as high as 5 million, but it continued to drop further and further. So much so that by February 7th, 1954, the High Line continued to cease service. And so this was the last group of people that rode the High Line from Springfield to Kansas City. And here we are inside with the happy crew as they go off for their last run. So what caused this? Well, I blame this guy, General Eisenhower, and his crazy idea to have this interstate highway system. No, I'm just kidding. We needed a highway, but it did create quite a bit of a toll on the rail yards and the railroads themselves. So, unfortunately, ever since World War II, we had a steady decline in passenger train miles, meaning these were the amount of tracks that were either abandoned or tore up. And as we get into 1960 to 67, they had dismantled or tore up quite a bit. Some of the crews, unfortunately, this was their job to go down the line and tear those tracks out and use them for scraps or salvage. I couldn't imagine being on there. It'd be like cutting your own arm off. So we are now getting into the waning days of 1967 for passenger service down at Millen, Maine. Once again, our good friend Mr. Millard Morrow was there to document, and here we go. I only wish he had some sound. It would be nice to have some sound mix. Maybe one day I'll sit down and add some sound to this. Well, as you notice, the passenger cars coming in, the Frisco wasn't much on creating large amount of passenger cars that all matched. They did have some, but for the most part, they were a frugal railroad and utilized whatever they had, and especially by this time. And there goes one of the beautiful racehorses leaving. So this one was more than likely either headed down towards Memphis or up towards St. Louis. And the final goodbye. Well, the end was near. March 5th, 1977, and after years of talk of the station being utilized for a restaurant, shopping, many different things, for whatever reason the case may be, it didn't work out. So on March 5th, it came down. It was quite the sight, and I'm sure it was quite the struggle because it was built so exceptionally well. But it is one of the saddest turning parts in this town's history. Today, all that's left are some of the footers and the tile for the floor that's in the Harvey house, as well as some of the brick. Then an even sadder day occurred. So 3 years later, the Frisco and the Burlington Northern, the merger was approved. And very soon thereafter, 304 employees lose their job. And then we started seeing BN slapped on all the locomotives. Many of the Frisco employees had some, of course, we didn't have internet and stuff back then, so there were some rather crude drawings that were put up, not being very favorable towards the Burlington Northern. But the promise, it was supposed to be a greater railroad, and a lot of people quite didn't see it that way at all. And that's probably one of the saddest ones that they drew. Well, this one is probably a great memory for a lot of folks. This was the last Frisco group photo. Of course, you couldn't do this today. OSHA would have a cow, and nobody's wearing a harness. But nobody cared. They had a lot of pride, and they wanted their picture taken by this locomotive. 1996, the Frisco diesel shop is closed as further railroad scrutiny on profit is looked at, and they finally decided that they were going to shift and move and close and expand certain shops. Unfortunately, Springfield was not one of them. 211 employees lose their job. By fall of 2005, the diesel shops started coming down. Today, this is all that's left. Just the tracks leading up, nothing more. Well, the Springfield West shops, which were one of the pride and joys of the railroad for so long, its days too were numbered. Frisco West shops, built in 1909, came down just 1 year after it completed its 100th anniversary. They had been utilized for another company to work on their cars, but no longer needed the buildings. Taxes being the way they are, it was too high to pay taxes on these massive buildings, and trying to create museums or different things, nothing seemed to work out, so they took them down. So can we still see the Frisco and Springfield? Yes, we can. We don't have a true dedicated Frisco museum per se, as we did on Commercial Street for a time, but we do have the Railroad Historical Museum at Grant Beach Park, and these guys are a fine group of volunteers that either have or had worked for the railroad and just have a great passion. So if you get an opportunity, I'm sure they'd love to see you out there. They're open from May to October. They just finished up their last one, I believe, for this year, in 2019. But you'll be able to catch them in 2020 next May. Just call that number and they'll be more than happy to help you out. Of course, our beautiful Northern 4524 is based out there, and they've done a nice job doing a cosmetic restoration and got all the valves and, they've got all of the instrumentation and stuff put back into place, so you can really get a feel for what the locomotive was like if you got a chance to sit in the engineer seat. And just recently, they dedicated the Max John Depot, and just to give you a nice flair for what it was like to go to one of these depots that were up and down the line. Missouri has lost so many of them. You can see one like in St. James, Arkansas. The Arkansas run, except for Rogers, they still have all their original depots, so that's worth going down to see. But it's nice that we have this depot in the park to kind of give people a feel what it was like to get off the train and go in and browse around. Well, I want to give a big word of thanks. There's a lot of people like to talk about, but there's a couple in particular that have gave so much to me for history and for presenting, and that's Don Worth. Don's been a great guy, and that's Don who is pictured here in the engineer spot at 1522. Carl Brandt, who has just been an absolute blessing for history and correcting me when I'm wrong and giving me the goodies that we need. But I'm ever so thankful to have Carl there to help us out. Jeff Cooney, who also has a great collection, who's been nice enough to share some things with us. And of course, I can't say enough about Lyndall Morrow. Lyndall's family has been instrumental in this whole program. So with that being said, let's talk about them briefly. Lyndall's Morrow family stretches over 123 years of railroad history connected to the Frisco. Starting off with Alonzo Morrow, he started working in 1916 as a laborer and was a fireman within the same year, and engineer by 1925. And then he retired after 43 years of service in 1959. And this is Alonzo with Lyndall and Lyndall's brother Jerry. Well, Millard Leslie Morrow, he started in 1941. And here we have his first paycheck, $5.50. These are the boys. That's his first locomotive. He started out on a switcher, but he had taken the boys down to see 1522 when she rolled back into town. And here you can see them roaming around the cab. Now, she was in the process of being cleaned up and sent up to St. Louis for display. And then we can see her in the yards here. She's in pretty rough shape. Definitely in need of a good paint job. And the cool thing is, some 30-odd years later, she's back here at the West Shops, fully restored, under steam. And if you ever got a chance to see her run or hear her whistle, it's quite something else. Miller's last trip started on October 28, 1978, and ended October 29, 1978, and he retired after 37 years as a fireman and engineer. Well, then we get Lyndall Eugene Morrow. Well, Lyndall, I mean, he literally grew up there, so he'd been there pretty much his entire life, and so it just made sense that he would also come to work for the railroad. His family was all over the place, as Lyndall worked practically every spot you could in the West Yards. And after 43 years of service, Lyndall retired on October 2nd, 2017. So he does have I believe his brother's son works out there. So really the Morrow family continues working in the North Yards of Springfield. And for those of you that aren't familiar with it or have not joined, I'd love for you to join the Springfield, Missouri History, Landmarks, and Vintage Photography page. That way you could see how the Frisco impacts Springfield with all the many posts that are on there and other things, and we'd love to have you part of our group. And of course, there's the Ship It on the Frisco page. If you're not already a member, I would highly recommend joining that one as well. And I want to thank all of you that have made it to the end of this presentation. I know it was about a good hour or so, but I enjoyed the presentation of getting this information to you, and I hope you look forward to more to come. Take care.